The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground of the Galactic Military Academy as hundreds of cadets stood in perfect formation. Their uniforms gleamed under the artificial light, and their chests displayed a rainbow of medals, ribbons, and honors that told the story of their achievements and family pride. Commander Kale of the Draconian Fleet stood on the observation platform, watching the weekly ceremony with keen interest. His reptilian features showed no emotion, but his golden eyes moved carefully from one group to the next, studying each species and their traditions. The Altarian cadets sparkled like living crystals, their translucent skin reflecting the light from dozens of crystal medals that hung from silver chains. Each crystal represented a different achievement in their peaceful civilization, academic excellence, diplomatic success, or artistic mastery. The vegan warriors stood like mountains of muscle and bone, their gray skin marked with ritual scars that spoke of battles won and enemies defeated. Their medals were made of rare metals, forged in the heart of dying stars, and each one told a story of courage in combat. The larger the medal, the greater the victory, and some of the older vegan cadets wore decorations so massive they seemed to weigh down their powerful frames. Even the gentle Cedian diplomats wore their honors proudly. Small, delicate pins made from precious stones adorned their flowing robes, each one representing a successful negotiation or a peace treaty that had prevented war. Their medals might have been small, but they were numerous, creating intricate patterns across their chests that showed decades of service to galactic harmony. But there was one cadet who stood out, not because of what she wore, but because of what she did not wear. Yuna Kim stood in the third row of the human section, her posture perfect, and her attention focused straight ahead like every other cadet. But her uniform was completely bare. No medals, no ribbons, no decorations of any kind. Just the plain gray fabric of a standard academy uniform with nothing to show for her achievements or her past. This puzzled Kale more than he cared to admit. He had been observing human cadets since. His assignment to the academy began 6 months ago, and he had learned much about their strange and unpredictable species. Most humans arrived at the academy covered in so many medals that they needed special reinforced uniform jackets to hold them all. Their species seemed to give awards for everything: combat excellence, academic achievement, leadership skills, marksmanship, even something called good conduct, which appeared to be an award for simply following rules. The humans were a young species barely 200 years into space travel, but they had already managed to fight more wars than most civilizations experienced in 1,000 years. They gave medals for surviving battles, for winning battles, for losing battles with honor, and even for battles that never happened but might have. The human cadets often spent their free time comparing their decorations and telling stories about how they earned each one, but not Yuna Kim Kale had been watching her for weeks, and her performance was outstanding. She scored in the top 3% of every examination, passed every physical test with ease, and showed tactical thinking that impressed even the veteran instructors. Her combat simulations were flawless. Her leadership exercises were textbook perfect, and her academic work was consistently excellent. Yet she wore nothing to show for any of it. During combat training that afternoon, Kale positioned himself where he could observe the human section more closely. The exercise was a simple one-squad level tactics against a simulated enemy position. Most cadets approached it in predictable ways. The Vegans used brute force, the Altarians tried to negotiate, and the Cedians looked for diplomatic solutions. But Yuna did something different. While her squad mates prepared for a frontal assault, she seemed to disappear, melting into the shadows of the training ground like smoke. Her movements were so quiet that even Kyle, with his enhanced hearing, could barely detect her presence. She reappeared behind the enemy position 15 minutes later, having somehow bypassed all their sensors and security measures. When the exercise ended, her team had achieved complete victory with 0 casualties. The instructor Vex from the Altarian Defense Corps looked confused as he reviewed the results. How did you penetrate their defenses, Cadet? Kim, he asked. Your approach is not covered in any of our tactical manuals. Yuna stood at attention, her expression neutral. Self-study Sir humans have access to extensive historical databases, but Kale noticed things the instructor missed. The slight tension in her shoulders when she spoke, the way her eyes swept the area, checking exits and potential threats, the calluses on her hands that spoke of weapons training far beyond what the academy provided. These were not the signs of a student who had learned from books. After the exercise, Kale found himself walking beside Yuna as the cadets returned to their quarters. The other species had learned that humans appreciated direct conversation rather than the subtle hints and implications that most galactic civilizations preferred. Cadet Kim, he said, keeping his voice casual, I have been observing your performance, and I must say it is quite impressive. Thank you, sir, she replied without looking at him. Your tactical knowledge seems unusually advanced for someone your age. Most cadets your age rely on academy training, but you show familiarity with techniques that are not taught here. Yuna stopped walking and turned to face him. Her dark eyes met his golden ones without hesitation or fear. She was smaller than most human females, barely reaching his shoulder. But there was something in her gaze that made him think of predators he had encountered on his homeworld, dangerous creatures that appeared harmless until they struck. I study hard, sir, she said simply. Kale decided to be more direct. That is commendable, but I notice you wear no medals or honors. This seems unusual for a human. Cadet, your species appears to value recognition and achievement, yet you display none. For a moment something flickered across Yuna's face. Too quick for most beings to catch, but Kale had been trained to read micro-expressions in dozens of species. It looked almost like sadness or perhaps regret. Because the missions were not public, sir, she said quietly. The answer hit Kale like a physical blow. What missions, he asked, but Yuna had already started walking again. I need to prepare for evening studies. Sir, she called over her shoulder. Have a good day, Commander. Kale stood alone in the corridor as other cadets flowed around him like water around a stone. His mind raced with possibilities. What kind of missions were kept secret from a cadet's own people? In draconian culture, every act of military service was celebrated and recorded for future generations. Honor was not something to be hidden, but something to be displayed proudly so that others might follow your example. The idea of secret military service seemed wrong somehow, like trying to fight with one hand tied behind your back. How could a civilization function if its greatest heroes remained unknown? How could young people aspire to greatness if they never heard the stories of those who came before them? But as Kale walked back to his quarters, he found himself thinking about Yuna. Unusual skills, her ability to move without sound, to appear and disappear like a ghost, to use tactics that were not taught in any military academy he knew of. These were not the abilities of a normal cadet. They were the skills of someone who had seen real combat, someone who had learned to fight, not in simulations but in situations where failure meant death. That night, Kyle accessed his command codes and began searching through classified databases looking for any mention of secret human military operations. The search turned up nothing, but that in itself was suspicious. In his experience, nothing meant someone had worked very hard to make sure there was nothing to find. As he prepared for sleep, Kyle found himself staring out his window at the stars scattered across the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, humans were expanding their territory, exploring new worlds and encountering new challenges. And if Yuna was telling the truth, somewhere out there, human soldiers were fighting battles that would never be recorded, victories that would never be celebrated. The thought disturbed him more than he expected. What kind of war required such secrecy? What kind of enemy demanded that heroes remain forever unnamed? And what did it mean for the galaxy that humanity was fighting this hidden conflict while presenting themselves as simple newcomers seeking their place? Among the stars, Cale fell asleep with these questions echoing in his mind, unaware that seeking their answers would lead him into a darkness deeper than the space between stars and reveal truths that would shake his understanding of everything. He thought he knew about the galaxy and humanity's place in it. 3 weeks passed since Cale first questioned Yuna about her missing medals, and the mystery only deepened with each day. The human cadet continued to excel in every aspect of her training, yet remained completely silent about her past whenever anyone tried to probe deeper. Her answers were always short, polite, and revealed nothing. The academy instructors had noticed her unusual skills as well. Instructor Vex often pulled her aside after combat exercises to ask about techniques she used. That were not part of the standard curriculum. Yuna always gave the same response, that she studied historical databases and learned from human military records. But Cale could see the doubt in the instructor's eyes. Human records were available, too. Everyone at the academy, yet no other human cadet, displayed such advanced knowledge. Then came the day of the impossible scenario simulation. Every month, the academy ran a special exercise designed to test how cadets responded when facing hopeless odds. The simulation placed small cadet squadrons against overwhelming enemy forces with no possibility of victory. The goal was not to win, but to observe how different species reacted to certain defeat. Most cadets followed predictable patterns. Based on their cultural backgrounds, the Draconians fought with honor until the bitter end, preferring death to surrender. Their code demanded they face their enemies directly, even when outnumbered 1,000 to 1. The vegan warriors used brutal, overwhelming force, attempting to take as many enemies with them as possible before falling. The Altarians tried to find peaceful solutions even in combat scenarios, often attempting to communicate with the enemy AI in hopes of negotiation. But humans were different. Humans were unpredictable. Cale stood in the observation deck watching as 12 cadet squadrons entered their simulation pods. Each squadron consisted of 3 members from the same species, commanding a small patrol vessel against a massive enemy fleet. The odds were calculated to be exactly 0% chance of survival, with victory being mathematically impossible. Squadron after squadron launched into the simulation, and squadron after squadron died heroically. Each group lasted between 15 and 30 minutes before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The instructors recorded their tactics, their final communications, and their reactions to impending death, all valuable data for understanding how different species handled extreme stress. Then came Yuna's squadron. Her team consisted of herself as squadron leader, plus 2 other human cadets named Day and Minho. Both were competent students, but neither had shown the exceptional abilities that made Yuna stand out. Their simulation began like all the others, with 3 small patrol ships facing a massive enemy armada that filled the entire tactical display. But instead of engaging the enemy fleet, Yuna did something no cadet had ever done in the history of the exercise. She vanished. Her ship simply disappeared from all sensors, radar displays, and tracking systems. The other 2 human cadets, Day and Minho, continued fighting according to standard human tactics, using hit-and-run maneuvers to harass the enemy fleet. But Yuna was gone as if her ship had never existed. The instructors began checking for system malfunctions. Technical staff ran diagnostics on the simulation equipment, wondering if there had been a computer error. Instructor Vex started, preparing to mark Yuna as having fled from combat or suffered critical system failure when something impossible happened. The enemy command ship exploded, not from external attack, but from within. Massive explosions tore through its hull, destroying critical systems and killing the AI commanders that controlled the entire enemy fleet. Before anyone could process what had happened, a second enemy ship exploded, then a third, then a fourth. Within minutes, the entire enemy fleet was tearing itself. Apart from internal explosions that seemed to target exactly the right systems to cause maximum damage, command centers, weapons arrays, shield generators, and communication hubs all destroyed with surgical precision. The massive armada that had been unstoppable moments before was now a collection of drifting wreckage. Then, Yuna's ship reappeared on sensors exactly where it had started, as if it had never left. The simulation ended with a result that the computers could not process. Complete human victory with 0 casualties. Enemy fleet totally destroyed. Mission parameters exceeded beyond all calculations. The instructors stared at their displays in shock, while the other cadets whispered among themselves, trying to understand what they had witnessed. When the cadets emerged from their simulation pods, Instructor Vex immediately confronted Yuna. His crystal features showed confusion and concern as he demanded an explanation. Cadet, Kim, your tactics are not part of any curriculum we teach. Your ship disappeared from our sensors for 23 minutes and 17 seconds. During this time, the enemy fleet was systematically destroyed by unknown means. Please explain how this was accomplished. Yuna stood at attention, her expression calm and neutral. Self-study, sir. I analyzed the enemy ship designs and identified structural weaknesses that could be exploited through infiltration. But infiltration is impossible in this simulation. Vex protested. The enemy ships are heavily shielded and defended. No cadet vessel has the capability to penetrate their hulls undetected. Yuna shrugged slightly. Standard cadet vessels do not, sir. But with modifications to the sensor array and engine output, it becomes possible. The techniques are documented. In human historical files, Kale watched this exchange from the observation deck, noting details that others missed. The way Yuna's hands remained perfectly steady, while other cadets showed signs of adrenaline. The complete absence of surprise or excitement in her voice, as if destroying an impossible enemy fleet, was routine. The subtle tension in her shoulders that suggested she was prepared for more questions. She did not want to answer. The other human cadets, Day and Minho, looked as confused as everyone. Else they had been part of the simulation, but clearly knew nothing about Yuna's mysterious disappearance. When asked about their squadron's tactics, they could only say that Yuna had told them to continue normal attack patterns, while she handled a special mission. Later that evening, Kyle accessed the classified records of the simulation. He had security clearance that allowed him to review detailed sensor logs and tactical data that regular instructors could not see. What he found disturbed him more than he expected. Yuna's ship had not simply disappeared. It had used cloaking techniques that matched classified reports from the Outer Rim territories, reports of mysterious attacks on pirate bases and terrorist cells throughout human space, attacks where the perpetrators were never identified, where evidence was systematically erased, and where the only sign of human involvement was the surgical precision of the operations. The infiltration patterns were identical. The targeting priorities were the same. The method of using enemy systems against themselves was exactly what had happened in dozens of unsolved incidents throughout the galaxy. Kyle leaned back in his chair, staring at the data on his screen. The implications were staggering. If Yuna was somehow connected to these mysterious operations, then her presence at the academy was not what it seemed. No 18-year-old cadet should possess such advanced knowledge of covert operations. No student should be able to perform techniques that matched the work of ghost operatives who had been active for years. He thought about her words from weeks before. Because the missions were not public, at the time he had assumed she meant training exercises or perhaps minor colonial conflicts. But now he wondered if she had been referring to something much more significant. Something that required the kind of skills she had just demonstrated. The human cadets had access to extensive historical databases, she claimed, but historical records did not teach someone how to infiltrate enemy vessels undetected or how to sabotage complex systems with such precision. These were skills that came from experience from actual combat operations, from missions that could not be discussed in polite. Company Kale closed the classified files and sat in darkness thinking about what he had witnessed. The simulation had been designed to be impossible, yet Yuna had not just survived it, she had achieved total victory using methods that should not exist. And she had done it all while maintaining the fiction that she was just another student learning from books. Somewhere in the human territories, things were happening that the Galactic Federation did not know about, operations that required. Skills like Yuna possessed missions that could never be made public, heroes who could never be recognized. And if his suspicions were correct, this young cadet sitting in her dormitory room studying for tomorrow's exams was already a veteran of conflicts. That officially did not exist. The thought sent a chill through his reptilian blood as he realized that humanity might be far more dangerous and far more capable than anyone in the galaxy suspected. Sleep did not come easily to Kyle that night. His mind raced with questions about what he had witnessed in the simulation and what it might mean for everything he thought he understood about humanity. At midnight, he gave up trying to rest and made his way to the Academy observation deck, hoping that the sight of stars might calm his troubled thoughts. The observation deck was one of the few places in the Academy where beings could be alone with their thoughts. A massive transparent dome that offered a perfect view of the galaxy stretching endlessly in all directions. Most cadets avoided it during sleeping hours, preferring the comfort of their quarters to the vast emptiness of space. But Kale was not alone. Yuna stood near the center of the dome, her small figure silhouetted against the starfield. She did not turn when he entered, moving with the same silent grace that had become her trademark among the cadet corps. Her attention seemed focused on a distant nebula, its purple, and gold clouds glowing faintly in the darkness. "You have been asking questions about me," she said without looking at him. Her voice carried no accusation or anger, just a simple statement of fact. Kale approached slowly, keeping his movements casual and non-threatening. "Your performance raises questions. Your methods suggest training far beyond what any civilian cadet should possess." Yuna was quiet for several minutes, continuing to stare at the nebula. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, almost whisper quiet. "What do you know about Earth?" "Early space expansion, Commander." The question seemed unrelated to their previous conversation, but Kyle had learned that human discussions often took unexpected directions. The historical records show typical colonial expansion, some conflicts with indigenous species, standard resource disputes, the usual growing pains of a species reaching for the stars. The public records Yuna corrected, still not looking at him. But what happens when a species encounters threats that would cause panic if the general population knew about them? What happens when first contact is not with friendly traders or honorable warriors, but with something that views your entire species as prey? A chill ran through Kale's scaled body despite the controlled temperature of the observation deck. In all his years of military service spanning 3 different sectors and dozens of different conflicts, he had never heard even hints of such encounters in human space. The humans who joined the Galactic Federation had been portrayed as newcomers to interstellar politics, slightly more aggressive than most species, but ultimately civilized beings seeking their place among the established galactic community. There are things in the dark between stars. Commander Yuna continued, her voice barely audible. Things that hunt civilizations, that feed on fear and chaos and suffering. Most species never encounter them because they are not aggressive enough, not spread out enough, not curious enough to draw their attention. She paused, and for the first time since he had arrived, she turned to look at him. Her dark eyes reflected the starlight, and in them Kale saw something that made his blood freeze. It was not fear. Exactly. but a kind of weary knowledge that no 18-year-old should possess, the look of someone who had seen horrors that most beings could not imagine, but humans. She continued with a sad smile crossing her features. Humans are curious about everything we explore, every system we can reach. We ask questions about every anomaly we discover. We poke and prod and investigate until we find answers. And sometimes the answers find us. First, Cale felt his military training warring with disbelief. Everything he had learned about galactic history suggested that space was dangerous but predictable. Pirates and raiders existed, of course, and territorial disputes were common, but the idea of unknown predator species lurking in the void seemed like something from ancient mythology. You are suggesting there are threats the Galactic Federation does not know about? He asked. I am suggesting there are threats the Federation has never had to face, because others have been dealing with them quietly. Behind the scenes, without recognition or acknowledgement, Yuna's hand unconsciously moved to her chest where medals should have hung. Some missions can never be public, Commander. Some victories can never be celebrated. The implications of her words hit Kyle like a physical blow. If she was telling the truth, then humanity was not the simple newcomer species they appeared to be. They were warriors fighting a secret war against enemies so terrible that knowledge of their existence had to be hidden from the rest of the galaxy. How long, he asked. How long has this been going on? Since before we joined the Federation, Yuna replied. Since our first deep space colonies started disappearing. At first, we thought it was equipment failure or pirate raids, but the pattern was wrong. Ships would vanish without distress calls. Colonies would go silent overnight with no signs of battle or evacuation. She moved closer to the dome, placing her hand against the transparent surface, as if trying to touch the stars beyond. Her reflection looked ghostly against the star field. We sent investigation teams. She continued. Most never returned. The few that did come back brought reports that made no sense. Stories of impossible geometries and creatures that existed, partially outside normal space. Things that could not be fought with conventional weapons or understood through conventional thinking. So we adapted. Yuna's voice grew harder. We learned to fight monsters by becoming monsters ourselves. We developed techniques that would horrify other species because sometimes horror is the only language these things understand. We trained soldiers who could operate in the spaces between dimensions, who could think like predators and hunt like ghosts. Kyle stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about human nature. They were aggressive, yes, and somewhat unpredictable, but this suggested something far more profound. An entire hidden aspect of their civilization dedicated to warfare against impossible enemies. The Shadow Fleet, she said, answering his unspoken question. Ships that officially do not exist. Crews who gave up their identities and any hope of recognition. Veterans who return to normal society and pretend. They never saw the things they saw, never fought the battles they fought. Your simulation today, Cale said, understanding beginning to dawn, was basic infiltration technique, she confirmed. The kind of thing any Shadow Fleet operative learns in their first year. The enemy ships were simple compared to what we usually face. Static, predictable, following logical patterns. Real enemies adapt and evolve and learn from every encounter. She turned away from the dome and faced him directly. Her expression was calm, but Cale could see the weight she carried in her eyes, the burden of knowledge that could never be shared. I was recruited at 15, she said quietly, after my family was killed in an attack that officially never happened. 3 years of training that pushed me beyond normal human limits, learning to fight enemies that exist partially outside reality itself. My admission to this academy is part of my cover, a way to blend in while I wait for my next assignment. The observation deck fell silent except for the quiet hum of life support systems. Cale found himself staring at this young woman who looked like any other cadet, but who carried secrets that could shake the foundations of galactic civilization. "Why tell me this?" he asked. "Why reveal something so dangerous?" "Because you were going to keep digging," she replied with a slight smile. "And because eventually you would have found enough pieces to put together a picture that might have been more dangerous than the truth. The Shadow Fleet exists, Commander. We have been protecting the galaxy for decades from threats that would drive other species insane if they knew such things were real." She walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back at him. "The medals I could wear," she said softly. "They are for missions where entire star systems would have fallen if we had failed, but they are also for actions that violate every law of warfare the Federation recognizes. We use methods that would horrify other species, because sometimes horror is the only thing that works against true monsters." And with that, she was gone, leaving Cale alone with the stars, and the terrible knowledge that humanity was far more than they appeared to be. In the darkness between worlds, a secret war raged on, fought by heroes whose names would never be known, whose victories could never be celebrated, and whose sacrifices kept the galaxy safe from nightmares that should not exist. 7 days passed after Yuna revelation in the observation deck, and Cale found himself studying every human cadet with new eyes. He watched for signs of the hidden knowledge she had described, the subtle tells that might indicate others who carried similar secrets. But if there were more Shadow Fleet operatives among the Academy students, they remained perfectly disguised. Then came the distress signal that would test everything. Yuna had told him the message arrived during morning formation, crackling through the Academy communication systems with the urgent priority code that meant immediate danger. The transmission was badly garbled, filled with interference and strange harmonics that hurt to listen to. But the terror in the communications. Officer voice was unmistakable before the signal cut to dead static. Deep Space Research Station Kepler-7 requesting immediate assistance. Unknown contact detected approaching station. All defensive systems offline. Casualties mounting rapidly. Please respond. Please someone respond. The transmission ended in a scream that was cut short, leaving only silence. Academy protocols were clear in such situations. Alert the nearest Federation fleet and wait for proper military response. The closest combat vessels were 3 days' travel from Kepler-7, but they had the firepower and experience necessary to handle any serious threat. A group of cadets, no matter how well trained, should never be sent into actual danger. But Instructor Vex saw an opportunity for advanced training. A long-range patrol exercise had already been scheduled for that sector, and senior cadets needed experience with real crisis situations. The research station was probably dealing with equipment failures or, at worst, a pirate raid. Nothing that modern cadet vessels could not handle. Cale requested permission to observe the mission officially, to evaluate multi-species cooperation under stress conditions. Unofficially, he wanted to see how Yuna would respond to whatever they found at Kepler-7. His instincts told him this was no ordinary emergency. The mission team consisted of 12 senior cadets representing 6 different species. Day, a massive Vegan warrior, served as mission commander due to his combat experience and leadership scores. The others included 2 Altarians, known for their technical skills, 3 Cetians who excelled at communication and analysis, 2 more humans besides Yuna and cadets from the other major Federation species. The journey to Kepler-7 took 18 hours traveling at maximum safe speed through hyperspace. During the trip, most cadets speculated about what they would find. Equipment malfunction seemed most likely given the strange interference in the distress. Signal pirate attacks were possible, though unusual, so deep in Federation space. Some wondered about alien contact, suggesting they might encounter a new species that was simply misunderstood. But Yuna remained unusually quiet, While others talked and theorized, she spent her time in the communications bay running scans and analysis that seemed far more sophisticated than standard academy equipment should allow. Kyle watched her work, noting the way her fingers moved across control panels she should not know how to operate, and the complex data patterns she was examining. "Commander," she said during the second day of travel, approaching him when they were alone in the corridor, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust my judgment." "When we reach the station." "What kind of question?" he replied. "If I tell you we need to leave immediately, will you support that order even if it goes against the mission commander decision?" Kale studied her face, looking for any sign of deception or uncertainty. But Yuna's expression was completely serious. The look of someone preparing for a situation she hoped would not occur. "That would depend on the circumstances," he said carefully. "No," Yuna replied, "it would not. There will not be time for explanation or debate. If I say we leave immediately, or everyone on these ships will die. Do I have your word?" The certainty in her voice was disturbing, but Kale found himself nodding. "Yes, you have my word." When they finally reached Kepler 7, what they found defied all expectations. The research station hung in space exactly where it should be, completely intact, with all systems apparently functional. External lights blinked in normal patterns, the docking bays showed green status, and even the station. Gardens were visible through observation windows, looking healthy and well-maintained. There were no signs of battle damage, no evidence of explosive decompression or system failures, but the station was completely silent. No response to communication. Attempts. No life signs on any sensor sweep. No movement visible through the transparent sections. The massive research facility that should have housed 300 scientists and support staff appeared to be totally empty, as if everyone had simply vanished. "It is like a ghost ship," Day muttered, his usual confidence shaken by the eerie scene. The other cadets offered various theories. Mass evacuation seemed possible, though there was no record of any ships leaving the station. Contamination could have forced everyone into sealed areas that blocked sensor scans. Equipment failure might have knocked out internal communications while leaving external systems functional. But Kale noticed that Yuna was not looking at the station at all. Her attention was focused on the empty space around it, her expression growing more tense with each passing minute. She was scanning areas where sensors showed nothing but empty void, as if searching for something that should not be there. "We need to leave," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the speculation of the other cadets. "Now, what are you talking about?" Day demanded. "We have not even attempted boarding yet. There could be survivors inside waiting for rescue." "There are no survivors," Yuna replied, with chilling certainty. "And if we do not leave immediately, there will be no survivors on our ships either." Before anyone could respond, the space around them began to change. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist in ways that hurt to look at directly. The darkness between stars started to move, not like objects traveling through space, but like the space itself was alive and shifting. Colors appeared that had no names, geometries formed that made no sense, and something vast and impossible began to emerge from dimensions that should not exist. The thing that came through the dimensional rift was beyond the comprehension of any species in the Federation. It was not a ship or a creature in any recognizable sense, but rather a living manifestation of hunger and malevolence. The research station had not been attacked or invaded. It had been drained, every living soul consumed to fuel this entity's existence. Most of the cadets froze in terror as their minds struggled to process what they were. Seeing the entity presence created a psychic pressure that paralyzed thinking beings, leaving them helpless as it prepared to feed on their life force. But Yuna moved with practiced efficiency, her hands flying over control panels she somehow knew how to operate. "Kale," she called to the Draconian commander, her voice cutting through the paralyzing fear. I need you to override the communications array, authorization code, Midnight Sun, 77. The code was classified beyond anything a cadet should know, military encryption used only for the most sensitive operations. But Kale found himself complying automatically, his command training overriding his confusion. As soon as the override was complete, Una began broadcasting on frequencies that did not appear on any standard communication charts. Her message was brief and coded, but within minutes, space around them began to fill with ships that appeared from nowhere. Vessels that bore no insignia, followed no design patterns known to the Federation, and moved with coordination that spoke of years of practice. These ghost ships immediately engaged the dimensional entity with weapons that seemed specifically designed to harm beings of its nature. The battle was brief, but intense. Reality itself seemed to buckle under the strain of forces that operated outside normal physics. The entity fought back with attacks that existed partially in other dimensions, striking at the minds and souls of its opponents rather than their physical forms. But the mysterious ships had experience with such warfare, and their weapons found their mark. When it was over, the entity had been driven back into whatever dark dimension it called home. The research station remained intact but empty, a monument to the hundreds who had died to feed an impossible hunger. And the ghost ships were already beginning to fade from sensors as if they had never existed, but not before one of them transmitted a brief message in a voice that was definitely, "Human package is secure." Returning to base, Shadow Fleet out, as the cadet ships limped back toward the academy, their crews shaken by an encounter that would haunt their dreams. Una finally broke her silence. That was a void feeder, she explained to the stunned cadets. They exist in the spaces between dimensions, drawn to large concentrations of thinking beings. Most species never encounter them because they are not widespread enough or curious enough to create a sufficient psychic signature, but humans are, Kale said, understanding the full implications. Humans are everywhere. Una confirmed. Our expansion pattern, our curiosity, our tendency to spread into every corner of space we can reach makes us a beacon for things like that. So some of us learn to fight them quietly without recognition, because the galaxy does not need to know that there are monsters in the dark. The journey back to the academy took 3 days, but felt like 3 years. The cadet crews sat in stunned silence trying to process what they had witnessed. Some had already begun to convince themselves it had been a hallucination brought on by stress or equipment malfunction. The mind has ways of protecting itself from truths too terrible to accept. But Kyle could not forget, and neither could the other cadets who had looked directly at the void feeder. The memory burned in their minds. Like acid eating away at their assumptions about reality and the nature of the galaxy, they thought they knew. Every time someone tried to dismiss what happened as impossible, the image would return, and silence would fall. Una spent most of the return journey in isolation. The other cadets avoided her now. Whether from fear or revulsion, Kale could not tell. She had saved all their lives, but in doing so had revealed herself as something far removed from the normal academy experience. The comfortable illusion that they were all students learning together had been shattered. On the second day approached Kale in the ship's small observation lounge. The massive vegan warrior looked smaller, somehow diminished by what he had seen. His usual confidence had been replaced by a haunted expression that aged his features. "Commander," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many of them are there?" Kale did not need to ask what he meant. How many entities like the void feeder? How many threats lurking in the darkness between stars? How many nightmares waiting to devour civilizations that had no idea such things existed? I do not know. He replied honestly, but I suspect we are about to find out. That evening, Kale found Una in the communication bay, reviewing sensor logs from their encounter. She looked up when he entered, but said nothing. Her expression was unreadable as always, giving no hint of the thoughts behind her dark eyes. The other cadets are having difficulty processing what happened. He said, "They will adapt," she replied, returning to her work. Minds are flexible when survival depends on it, and if they do not adapt, then they will spend the rest of their lives jumping at shadows and waking up screaming, but they will be alive to do so, which is more than the research station crew can say. Kale sat down across from her, noting how her fingers moved across the control panels with practiced ease. These were not the movements of someone learning new systems, but of someone who had used similar equipment many times before. "How many void feeders are there?" he asked. "No one knows," she replied without looking up. "They exist in dimensions parallel to ours, occasionally crossing over when something attracts their attention. Large concentrations of thinking beings serve as beacons in the darkness. Some feed on psychic energy, others on fear and despair. A few consume physical matter, but most prefer the essence of consciousness itself. That is why research stations are vulnerable," Kale realized. Hundreds of brilliant minds working together, creating exactly the kind of signal these things hunt for. Yuna nodded. Research stations, deep space, colonies, exploration vessels anywhere, humans gather in large numbers, becomes a potential target, and as our expansion continues, we encounter more of them. "How do you fight something like that?" "You do not fight them," she said, finally looking up from her work. "You survive them. You learn their patterns, their weaknesses, their feeding cycles. You develop weapons that can harm beings existing partially outside normal space. You train operatives who can think like predators and move through dimensions most minds cannot comprehend." She stood and moved to the small viewport, showing the stars streaming past as they traveled through hyperspace. "But mostly you sacrifice," she continued quietly. "You accept that some battles cannot be won, only survived. You learn to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. You become something other than what you were before. Because the alternative is extinction." Kyle studied her profile against the starlight. She looked so young, barely out of adolescence. But her words carried the weight of someone who had seen horrors beyond imagination. "How many others are there? Like you, more than you might think, fewer than we need," she replied. "Every major human colony has at least a few Shadow Fleet recruits living normal lives until they are needed. Every exploration ship carries someone trained to recognize the signs of dimensional incursion. Every research station has protocols for dealing with entities that officially do not exist. The scope of the deception was staggering. An entire hidden military force embedded throughout human civilization, ready to respond to threats that the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed. It explained so much about human behavior, their apparent fearlessness when exploring dangerous regions, their willingness to establish colonies in areas other species avoided, their casual acceptance of losses that would traumatize other civilizations. "We are not the newcomers. Everyone thinks we are," Kale said. "No, we are not," Yuna agreed. "We have been fighting this war for longer than most species have had space travel. We learned early that the galaxy is not a safe place for curious civilizations, so we adapted. We became something that could survive in the darkness, between stars." She turned away from the viewport and faced him directly. "When we reach the academy, you will file a report about equipment malfunction at the research station. System failure caused by experimental technology led to evacuation. You will recommend further investigation by proper military authorities, but you will not mention what we actually encountered, and the other cadets will follow your lead or face consequences they are not prepared for. The Shadow Fleet does not tolerate security breaches. Commander survival of the species takes priority over individual comfort." The implicit threat was clear, but Kale found himself nodding in agreement. The knowledge they now carried was too dangerous to spread. The other species in the Federation were not ready to learn that their expansion into space had been protected by human sacrifice. They preferred to believe the galaxy was civilized and predictable, with dangers that could be understood and overcome through proper military force. But the truth was far more terrifying. The universe was full of things that defied understanding, entities that existed beyond the reach of conventional weapons or rational thought, and humanity had appointed itself guardian against these horrors, accepting the burden of secrets that could never be shared. That night, as Cale tried to sleep, he found himself thinking about all the human colonies that had mysteriously failed over the years, all the exploration ships that had vanished without explanation, all the research projects that had been quietly abandoned after promising starts. How many of those had been consumed by things like the Void Feeder? How many lives had been lost to keep the rest of the galaxy safe, and how many humans carried the same burden as Una, living double lives as ordinary citizens while carrying the knowledge that they were all that stood between civilization and chaos, fighting battles that could never be acknowledged, winning victories that would never be celebrated. The thought followed him into restless dreams filled with impossible geometries and hungry shadows that reached across dimensions to devour the light of conscious thought. When he woke the next morning, they were approaching the academy, and it was time to begin the careful process of forgetting what they had seen. But some truths, once learned, could never be completely erased, and Kyle knew that every time he looked at the stars, he would remember that the darkness between them was not empty, but filled with nightmares that only humanity seemed willing to face. The weeks following their return from Kepler 7 passed in carefully orchestrated normalcy. The official report listed equipment malfunction as the cause of the research station evacuation, with recommendations for improved safety protocols and better emergency response procedures. The other cadets gradually stopped having nightmares, though none of them would ever look at empty space the same way again. But for Cale, the real education was just beginning. His new security clearance arrived, without explanation, but with access to files that revealed the true scope of humanity. Secret War. The Shadow Fleet was far larger than he had imagined, with vessels operating throughout the galaxy, disguised as merchant ships, exploration craft, and even diplomatic vessels. Every major trade route had human ships monitoring for dimensional incursions. Every frontier colony had Shadow Fleet operatives ready to respond to threats that officially did not exist. The files painted a picture of a species that had learned to live with constant danger while presenting a facade of optimistic exploration to the rest of the galaxy. Human colonies failed at twice the rate of other species, but those failures were always attributed to natural disasters, equipment problems, or simple bad luck. The truth was that humanity was expanding into regions of space that other civilizations instinctively avoided. Areas where the barriers between dimensions were thin and hungry. Things waited in the darkness. Una continued her studies as if nothing had changed. She attended classes, completed assignments, and participated in training exercises with the same quiet competence she had always shown. But now Cale could see the signs he had missed before. The way her eyes constantly swept for potential threats. The unconscious habits of someone trained to sleep lightly and wake ready for combat, the casual familiarity with weapons and tactics that went far beyond academy curriculum. 3 months. After the Kepler 7 incident, Cale found himself assigned as liaison to a joint training exercise between the academy and regular fleet forces. It was a routine assignment meant to evaluate how well cadets worked with experienced military personnel. But when he saw the list of participating vessels, his blood ran cold. The merchant ship Golden Star was listed among the civilian craft, providing logistical support. But Cale had seen that ship before in classified files documenting Shadow Fleet operations. Its captain was officially a trader named Captain Park, but his real identity was Commander Jin Park, veteran of dozens of operations against dimensional entities. The exercise proceeded normally during daylight hours. standard tactical. Maneuvers, communication drills, and coordination between different vessel types. But at night, when most participants were resting, Golden Star would slip away from the main group for what appeared to be routine cargo transfers. Kyle followed one night, using his command ship-enhanced sensors to track the merchant vessel at long range. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. Golden Star was not transferring cargo, but engaging something that existed partially outside normal space. The battle lasted only minutes and left no trace on standard sensors, but Kale instruments detected energy signatures that matched those from the Void Feeder encounter. When morning came, Golden Star returned to the exercise as if nothing had happened, Captain. Park filed routine reports about successful cargo delivery and maintenance schedules. But Kale noticed that 2 of his crew members were missing, replaced by personnel who bore the same subtle signs he had learned to recognize in Una after the exercise ended. Kale requested a private meeting with Captain Park. The older human agreed, though his expression suggested he knew exactly why the meeting was necessary. They met in a small conference room aboard the Academy station with security, measures that ensured complete privacy. "You know what we are," the captain said, without preamble. "I am beginning to understand." Kale replied, "How long has this been going on?" Captain Park leaned back in his chair, looking older than his files indicated. "Since before we joined the Federation. Maybe before we developed faster-than-light travel. The first encounters were dismissed as hallucinations or equipment failure. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. He activated a holographic display, showing star charts with markers indicating incidents over the past century. The distribution was staggering, covering every major sector of human expansion, with concentrations near research facilities and frontier colonies. Most species expand slowly. The captain continued. They establish colonies in safe systems, avoid dangerous regions, and prefer to develop existing territories rather than explore new ones. But humans are different. We are curious about everything. We want to see what is beyond the next star system. What lies in that unexplored nebula? What secrets are hidden in the empty spaces? Other species avoid, and that curiosity attracts attention. Kale said, "Exactly. Dimensional entities are drawn to active consciousness, especially consciousness, engaged in discovery and exploration. A single human research station generates more psychic energy than most entire civilizations. Some of these things have been following our expansion for decades, learning our patterns and waiting for opportunities. To feed." The captain paused and looked directly at Kale. "So we learned to fight back, we